Well, thanks to all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. I know semesters are already always incredibly busy at this time, sort of the midpoint. So I hope you'll get something valuable out of this, or at least extra credit points or something. This did start out called The Myth of the 19th Amendment. The title has been only changed slightly. So let me start. On June 8, 2016, as most of you know, Hillary Clinton took the stage in Brooklyn to celebrate. She had secured enough delegates to become the presumptive Democratic nominee for President of the United States, the first woman to do so for any major political party. In marking the historic occasion, Clinton invoked her late mother, Dorothy Rodham, born on June 4, 1919. On the very day my mother was born in Chicago, Clinton told the crowd, Congress was passing the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. That amendment finally gave women the right to vote. Ratified in 1920, the 19th Amendment did prohibit federal and state governments from denying citizens the right to vote by reason of sex. But the claim that it established universal suffrage for all women in the United States is a myth. Although it extended the right to vote to millions of women, there were already millions of women voting in the United States, and millions more continued to be disfranchised. Do you want? Okay. Yeah. And millions more continued to be disfranchised for decades after 1920. Chicago women were among those already casting ballots since the Illinois legislature granted women municipal and presidential suffrage in 1913. Making all female residents of the state, black and white, eligible to vote a century ago in the 1916 presidential election. The standard narrative of women's suffrage in the United States traces the movement from the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention of 1848 to the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920, which declared that voting rights could not be denied on the basis of sex. The history generally portrays the West, where states and territories first granted rights to women, and you can see that on this map here by the blue colors. Those are the states that granted women voting rights first. And they see that as the vanguard of the movement, and the South with its seemingly steadfast opposition to black and female enfranchisement as the nation's backwater. Before the 1990s, most scholars highlighted a few national leaders as the engines of the movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul. In recent years, however, historians have critiqued those leaders as racist, elitist, and nativist in their views, especially Stanton and Paul, and have added women of color, Sojourner Truth, Frances Harper, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Barrier Williams, and others, to the pantheon of suffrage heroes. Yet the dominant chronology of the women's suffrage movement, 1848 to 1920, remains firmly entrenched in most history books, documentary films, and the mainstream media. So on election night, November 8th, you'll certainly hear that Hillary Clinton could become president, although 100 years ago, women couldn't even vote. Today, I'm going to tell you about the problems with that claim by placing race and region in the center of my analysis. From this perspective, we need to rethink not only the chronology and geography of the women's suffrage movement, but also the arenas in which critical battles were fought. It's important to remember that women sought voting rights not only in federal elections, but also in state and territorial elections, as well as churches, labor unions, reform organizations, school boards, and local governments. These latter efforts provided both a seedbed for state and federal campaigns and an alternate path for gaining material resources and collective power. Although American women first demanded the right to vote in the early 19th century, I'm going to begin the story today in the years immediately following the Civil War. Then debates over the enfranchisement of black men, most recently freed from enslavement, led to sharp divisions among former allies in the abolitionist and women's rights movements. It was the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the first granting citizenship to African Americans, and the second granting suffrage to black men, that divided these groups and transformed the political landscape for advocates of women's suffrage. Although historians often suggest that this contest pitted black men against white women, in fact, there were black women and men and white women and men on both sides of the debate. The complexity of these alliances is especially clear with the 15th Amendment. Certainly most black women and men supported the 15th Amendment, granting black men, but not black women, the right to vote. But they had staunch white allies like Lucy Stone, who was one of the most popular anti-slavery and women's rights lecturers in the 1850s and 60s. Similarly, although more white women opposed the 15th Amendment, some black abolitionists also critiqued it, including Robert Purvis, a Philadelphia free black who claimed he did not feel free to wield a right that his mother and sisters could not claim. The ways that race played out in the post-Civil War campaign for women's suffrage were shaped not only by the struggles over black male citizenship and enfranchisement, but also the continued westward expansion of the United States, which opened up new political opportunities as well as challenges. By exploring suffragist strategies in the post-war period and their campaigns for voting rights in Western states and territories, we can track the racial boundaries and identity that defined women's suffrage movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At the same time, it's critical to trace the independent efforts of African American immigrant and working class women whose campaigns for voting rights extended well beyond 1920. So let's begin in 1869, after the 14th Amendment granting citizenship to African Americans was ratified, and the 15th Amendment was being ratified. At that point, a new strategy for claiming female voting rights was developed by Virginia-born suffragists Frances and Virginia Minor. In 1869, this married couple of lawyers were practicing in Missouri, and their plan re-energized the women's suffrage movement and gave it a national agenda. The Minors argued that the 14th Amendment made all persons born or naturalized in the United States citizens, including women. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting as a right of citizenship, even if it did not explicitly mention sex, along with race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But they said it implied that that should apply to women as well as to men. So who joined this new departure movement? Between 1869 and 1873, thousands of women from towns and cities across the United States marched to registration offices and polling places. Some had supported the 14th and 15th Amendments, others had opposed them, but they all eagerly embraced the effort to expand their reach. New departure activists emerged in every region of the country. These are places in the North where we know women voted between 1869 and 1873, including Brooklyn, Rochester, New York, Vineland, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. These are from the West and the Midwest. And you can see it goes from Kansas to California. And even in the South, Baltimore, Memphis, Norfolk, Roanoke, Charleston, these are all places where women attempted to register and vote. We know the most about the northern efforts, where circles of longtime abolitionists and women's rights advocates attempted to register and vote. Black activist Sojourner Truth led the march to the polls in Battle Creek, Michigan, in the Midwest, where abolitionists and female health reformers joined forces. In Vineland, New Jersey, a planned community that attracted temperance advocates, dress reformers, and women's rights campaigners, female voters wore bloomers, that was sort of like Turkish trousers, to the polls, refused to pay taxes, and protested other forms of economic and occupational discrimination. Sympathetic town officials there registered women, accepted their ballots, and counted them in election results, which was highly unusual. In Rochester, New York, Susan B. Anthony was allowed to register and cast her ballot in 1872, but she was then arrested and convicted for fraudulent voting. But she was not alone. Some 50 Rochester women ventured to registrars and polling places in 1872, including abolitionist feminists like Amy Post, who was Frederick Douglass's first close friend in the city and the center of an interracial and mixed-sex circle of radical reformers. Now, voting in 1872 was a very public endeavor. Yet hundreds of women attempted to register and vote in the former slave states. In Washington, D.C., uniquely diverse circles of women joined the new departure. At least 28 women tried to register in spring 1868 before the new departure had even been officially launched. Most of these activists emerged from the interracial ranks of women working in the contraband camps, places filled with free people who fled north to D.C. or Alexandria, Virginia during the Civil War. In 1871, young black women with roots in northern anti-slavery struggles attempted to register and vote in D.C.'s first territorial elections. D.C. was considered a territory rather than a state. The famed black activist and orator Frederick Douglass accompanied them to the Board of Registrars. They were joined by some 60 other women, black and white, including female physicians, novelists, reformers, and a large contingent of female civil servants who worked as clerks in the Treasury Department during the Civil War. I suspect those white civil servants wanted the votes in order to gain leverage in maintaining their jobs and improving their wages as much for political reasons. In a few other southern cities, small numbers of white suffragists tried to register or vote as part of the new departure. There were 3 women in Baltimore, for example, a handful in Memphis, Tennessee, and a single white woman, Anna Boddicker, in Richmond, Virginia. In 1871, when Boddicker's vote was rejected by election officials, she insisted on depositing a handwritten message about women's rights in the ballot box instead. But the largest number of Southern women to turn out for a single election appeared in Johnson County, North Carolina in July 1871. And some of them were likely involved with the Freedom School there. There, 200 women successfully registered and cast ballots. All 200 were African American, and all were reported in the Women's Journal, a feminist newspaper of the day, to be dressed in men's clothing. Now, it's not clear whether they were actually dressed in men's clothing. If so, whether they were trying to pass themselves off as men or simply claiming male status symbolically as well as politically. But they may not have been following the lead of Virginia and Frances Minor at all, but rather the claims of the Rollin sisters. Louisa, Lottie, and Frances Rollin were 3 free black sisters from Charleston, South Carolina. And they seem to have developed a rationale independently of the new departure for women voting. Unfortunately, there are no pictures of any of the sisters. But we do know that they organized on behalf of women's rights immediately after the Civil War, their advocacy inspired in part by the fact that 7 of South Carolina's 8 black Reconstruction-era congressmen supported women's suffrage. In 1869, Louisa Rollin testified before the South Carolina House of Representatives on behalf of voting rights for women. A year later, Lottie chaired the founding meeting of the South Carolina Women's Rights Association in Columbia, which, like the American Women's Suffrage Association, supported the 15th Amendment. So we don't usually think of South Carolina as the kind of vanguard of the suffrage or women's rights movements or civil rights movements, but in the late 1860s, early 1870s, it was. Encouraged by African American election officials, at least 5 black women, including the Rollin sisters, registered and voted in October 1870, asserting women's right to suffrage under a federal enforcement act passed earlier that year. In response, several of the black officials were arrested by white authorities for accepting, quote, fraudulent ballots. So this was the version of voter fraud in 1870. They were sentenced to 6 months in prison and a $200 fine, which was an enormous amount of money in that period. The next year, 2 black women tried again in Charleston. This time they were arrested along with the officials, convicted, and fined $10 each plus court costs. After these 2 attempts, as far as we know, no other women tried to vote in South Carolina for decades. But it was the following July that the Johnson County, North Carolina women marched to the polls. The Johnson County women may also have harked back to the immediate post-Civil War period when Southern black women voted alongside men and even children in community meetings. African American women in Richmond, Virginia, here shown at the African Baptist Church in the city in 1867, helped select delegates to the state constitutional convention that year at a mass meeting at the 4,000-seat African Baptist Church. A standing vote allowed all the people present to participate. When African American men were enfranchised under the new state constitution, their wives and sisters lobbied male voters, accompanied them to the registrar in the voting booth, and continued to vote themselves in community-wide meetings. Across the South, it appears that many African Americans viewed the vote as a collective or familial rather than an individual possession. Whatever the various motives and visions of women voters in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the new departure and its counterparts in the Carolinas were short-lived. Susan B. Anthony, as I mentioned, was arrested by federal marshals in Rochester, New York in 1872 for casting her ballot, quote, while knowing she was a woman. She was tried in the federal district court, found guilty, and fined $100. That same year, Virginia Minor instituted a test case against a St. Louis registrar, a Mr. Rene Happersett, who had denied her the right to register. In 1875, the Supreme Court ruled in Minor v. Happersett that suffrage was not a right of national citizenship, but a privilege bestowed by the states. While some suffragists still urged the U.S. Congress to pass an amendment enfranchising women, many refocused their efforts on local, state, and territorial campaigns. Now, one of the advantages of these local and regional campaigns was that they attracted even more women to the cause. For example, Irish Catholic women joined nationalist land reform movements such as the National Land League in Ireland and the United States in the 1870s. There they gained political experience and began to demand political recognition. Women in the United States formed a Ladies' Land League in 1880 and sent delegates across the Northeast to organize branches. Although focused initially on raising funds and popular awareness about land issues in Ireland, they eventually grew more militant. For example, Marguerite Moore, a Ladies' Land League organizer in New York City, supported the socialist Henry George as mayor, led protests against the Catholic hierarchy when they removed priests who were sympathetic to Irish militants, and advocated women's suffrage, reminding the New York State Women's Suffrage Association in 1886 that they did not have the right of municipal, that is local suffrage, which had already been granted in England. This is Irish-American Mary Elizabeth Lease, who began her political career in the Ladies' Land League and then moved to Kansas and became a popular orator. The populist movements that attracted Lease and other immigrant women focused attention on state and territorial suffrage campaigns, especially in the West, where populist parties briefly gained control of some state legislatures. In the 1890s, male legislators in Colorado and Idaho enfranchised women following populist victories. These campaigns had roots in even earlier efforts beginning in Wyoming in 1869 to grant women the right to vote. By 1911, 6 states, all in the West, extended statewide suffrage to women, and an additional 6 granted women school or municipal suffrage, or both. 4 more Western states enfranchised women by 1918, including Texas, the first state which bridged the West and the South, while only 2 states outside the West, New York and Illinois, did so. Given the greater willingness of Western legislatures to grant women the vote, it's not surprising that both suffragists and suffrage historians hailed the region as the vanguard of the movement. Yet the story's more complicated if we focus on the racial dimensions of these laws. Asian American, Mexican American, and American Indian women were regularly denied the rights accorded native-born white and European immigrant women in the region. Idaho, for instance, had supposedly granted women full suffrage in 1896, but specifically excluded the insane, felons in convicts, bribe takers, polygamists, that is Mormons, persons of Chinese descent, and American Indians. In the Southwest, Mexican American women were denied the right to vote alternately as Mexicans and as women. Arizona granted the vote to women in 1912, but denied it to most people of Mexican descent. In neighboring New Mexico, Mexican Americans could vote, but not women, whatever their race. Race played a central role, not only in suffrage laws, but also in suffrage campaigns. In 1896, a women's suffrage referendum lost in California when the national populist and Democratic parties fused and decided that advocating women's suffrage was a liability. Although suffragists in the state gained the support of Spanish-language newspapers and some labor unions, they couldn't turn that progressive coalition into victory at the polls. Well, it was the major political parties that led to the defeat. National suffrage leader Anna Howard Shaw focused on the fact that native-born white women were denied voting rights, while some Chinese American men were enfranchised. She explained the outcome by claiming that every Chinese vote was against us. Of course, even if every Chinese vote in California was against them, it wouldn't have been enough to change the outcome. In 1911, suffragists in California persuaded the state legislature to allow another statewide referendum, and that year they won. Now, there were many reasons for this victory, including a new consumer-oriented approach to, quote, selling suffrage, in which massive billboards, parades, and other forms of advertising were put to political ends, like this campaign poster, which appeared all over California. Yet some California suffragists also embraced anti-Chinese sentiments in 1911, and even progressive white women wielded images of Chinese foot binding and sexual slavery to highlight their own status as modern citizens worthy of rights. Ironically, women in China were demanding rights, including suffrage, at the same time. When Chinese women reformers toured the Pacific Coast in the early 1900s, they challenged U.S. suffragists' promotion of Orientalist, that is, anti-Asian stereotypes. Nonetheless, when women gained voting rights in China's Guangdong province in 1911, U.S. suffragists used the fact that, quote, heathen Chinese had been granted the franchise to try to shame California legislators into granting voting rights to American women. And the tactic likely contributed to the women's suffrage victory that year. Now, native-born white suffragists developed similarly contradictory claims regarding American Indian women, portraying them alternately as victims of uncivilized men and as powerful symbols of women's traditional authority. Rather than emphasizing the parallels between Indian status as, quote, wards of the state and white women's status as legal minors, both requiring the protection of male patriarchs, many suffragists contrasted their own, quote, civilized state against impoverished and illiterate natives, who deserved pity rather than rights. By the 1880s, the federal government had created a legal division between so-called civilized and uncivilized Indians. In 1887, Congress endowed those who accepted individual land allotments with civilization and thereby citizenship, and dramatically increased the number of Indian citizens over the next 20 years. Yet it turned out that granting citizenship did not necessarily alter the status of Indians when it came to voting rights. In Arizona, a legal case emerged 8 years after passage of the 19th Amendment, when a female county official, Maddie Hall, refused to allow a Pima Indian man, Peter Porter, to vote. Making its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices upheld the disfranchisement of the state's Indians in Porter v. Hall on the grounds that, quote, natives were federal wards. Even many white suffragists who celebrated the traditional powers of women as matriarchs within what they called ancient tribes like the Iroquois agreed with the court's findings, since they considered modern Indian women unprepared for enfranchisement. Western states also mirrored patterns introduced by Southern states in the late 19th century, implementing literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers to deny particular groups of women and men the right to vote. The fact that Western states directly and indirectly limited voting by people of color suggests they were not as progressive as suffragists and historians have long claimed. At the same time, the Southern story is not as reactionary as often portrayed, because Southern women, black and white, did join women's suffrage campaigns in the late 19th century, and black Southern migrants participated in the successful campaigns for municipal and presidential suffrage in Illinois in 1913. Tennessee-born Ida B. Wells, shown here, moved to Chicago in 1896 after a rampage in her hometown of Memphis in which she was threatened to be lynched, and founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. Wells and the Alpha Club forged a coalition of black women's organizations to help persuade Illinois legislators and male voters to enfranchise black as well as white women in 1913. The Alpha Club played a critical role then in electing Oscar DePriest as Chicago's first black alderman 2 years later. We can illuminate similarly progressive developments in the South by attending there too to the story of African American women. While their protests against the disfranchisement of black men made little headway in the late 19th century, they were far more successful in campaigns for voting rights in churches and community institutions. The battle for voting rights in the Methodist Episcopal Church began in 1848 and culminated in 1872 when women's church suffrage was granted at the AME General Conference held in Charleston. This is now the very famous Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, where the mass killing took place several months ago. When women's suffrage was granted by the AME General Conference, then it led to a flood of other church-based suffrage battles. The AME Zion Church enfranchised women in 1876, and in the 1880s, Black Baptist women insisted on formal recognition of what had long been their important informal role in church governance. The victories of church women served as critical stepping stones to broader rights in the African American community, where churches rivaled political organizations as important sites of public culture. The organizational networks provided by churches and other community institutions allowed black women's electoral dreams to live on despite black men's disfranchisement and the racism of many white suffragists. The extent of these networks came to light in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The amendment was ratified on August 26th, and state Supreme Courts across the South ruled that there was too little time between late August and early November to implement literacy tests and poll taxes for newly enfranchised women. As a result, thousands of Southern black women joined white women at the polls that November. This photo shows women from Ettrick, Virginia, home of that state's first black college, the Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute, who went to vote in their hometown. Similar examples abound across the South. More than 2,400 black women voted in Richmond, Virginia in 1920, as well as in Norfolk and Raleigh, Norfolk, Virginia and Raleigh, North Carolina. Black women also voted in Tuskegee, Alabama, Galveston and Houston, Texas, Memphis, Tennessee, Tampa, Florida, and dozens of other cities and towns with either large African American populations or black colleges and universities. The ability of black women to mobilize across the South over a short period of time, from August to November 1920, reflects their success in developing an effective political infrastructure through churches and civic organizations in the previous decades. Of course, state and local authorities were quickly to close whatever loopholes the 19th Amendment had opened. So black women were quickly disenfranchised in these states after 1920, but they did not quietly acquiesce. They demanded that the National Woman's Party, founded immediately after the 19th Amendment was ratified, fight for black women's voting rights in the South. When leaders of that group argued that the remaining barriers were rooted in race, not sex, and thus were not their concern, black women returned to churches, unions, fraternal societies, women's clubs, and civic groups to make their case. Well, the memory of voting must have lived on in families and black women's organizations. It was quickly lost to scholars, the general public, and even later generations of black women leaders. In 1970, Dorothy Haight, president of the National Council of Negro Women, noted that the 19th Amendment had failed to enfranchise black women in the South and claimed, quote, "It took lynching, bombing, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Voting Rights Act to get voting rights for black women." In many ways, Haight was right. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 served as almost the final step in the long process of female enfranchisement. Because the 19th Amendment failed to enfranchise all American women, black women's political skills and networks were crucial in the suffrage battles that occurred from the 1930s on. We can demonstrate their importance, for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the 1940s. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court finally eliminated the white primary in the case of Smith v. Allwright. Prior to that ruling, the Democratic Party in many southern states, where it then reigned supreme, unlike today, excluded those blacks who managed to register to vote from participating in primaries. Since Democratic candidates won nearly all local and state elections in the South at the time, being excluded from the primary meant that blacks had no role, really, in choosing candidates for most political offices. Following the Smith v. Allwright decision, women leaders in Atlanta's NAACP, the Urban League, YWCA, and Neighborhood Union, led by Lugenia Burns Hope, worked to mobilize black voters. A massive voting rights campaign in 1946 raised black registration from around 8% of eligible voters to 27% in just 2 years. Grace Towns Hamilton, the local director of the Urban League, directed the logistical work of the campaign and sent women block by block and door to door to recruit potential voters, while Ruby Blackburn, who had organized domestic workers during World War II, mobilized working class groups. Both relied on the networks through black churches, schools, women's clubs, labor unions, and college fraternities and sororities to get out the message. Photographs documenting the long lines of potential registrants in Atlanta, shown here, show more women than men amid these vast throngs of potential voters. Moreover, women leaders spoke directly to women and their black sisters, proclaiming, quote, the ever-growing influence of women as a group and their special obligations to wield the ballot to the benefit of their families and communities. They thus combined general arguments for black suffrage with specific arguments for black women's suffrage. Now, Southern black women were not the only women barred from voting, and other groups excluded after the ratification of the 19th Amendment also launched or renewed campaigns for enfranchisement, and I'll mention just one here in concluding. Puerto Rican suffragist and labor activist Luisa Capetillo, who always dressed in a man's suit when she was out campaigning, had campaigned for women's suffrage in the 1910s in her home country, as well as in New York City, Florida, and Cuba. She supported the 19th Amendment, but was shocked when Puerto Rican women in Puerto Rico were denied its benefits. A judge advocate in the War Department ruled that the amendment did not apply in the nation's colonial possessions, including Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Led by Ana Roque de Dupré and Hanera Pagan, Puerto Rican women finally gained the right to vote in 1929, though even then literacy tests kept many women from the polls. Filipinas, too, struggled throughout the 1930s, seeking enfranchisement in the U.S. territory of the Philippines and then in an independent Philippines. In addition, large numbers of Spanish-speaking women and men particularly Mexican Americans in the West and Cubans in Florida, were denied voting rights until 1975, when the United League of Latin American Citizens and other Hispanic civil rights organizations convinced Congress to address bilingual issues when it extended the Voting Rights Act in 1975. In all these campaigns, women played central roles, claiming voting rights as members of racially excluded minorities, but also as women who had particular concerns as mothers and community leaders. There's still a lot of work to be done on the ways that gender shaped voting rights struggles in African American, Puerto Rican, Filipino, and Mexican American communities, as well as on the relationships between women of color and white women, once a majority of each group had been enfranchised. There are also, as you know, new forms of voter suppression, felon disfranchisement and voter ID laws, for instance, that seek to keep large numbers of men and women, especially voters of color, from casting ballots today. It's clear that the traditional narrative of women's suffrage in the United States that ends the story in 1920 limits our ability to fully comprehend the ways that race and region shaped and continue to shape battles for rights in local institutions and communities across the nation. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think what's most important, the broadest way I would talk about what effect the Voting Rights Act had on women voters is that black women turn out in a higher percentage than any other group of voters. So until the Voting Rights Act was passed, most black women were not able to go to the polls in the South. As soon as they got the right to go to the polls, whether it was after Smith v. Allwright in 1944, or after the Voting Rights Act in 1965, or after the Extended Voting Rights Act in 1975, black women turned out in the highest percentages of any group. So clearly, not allowing them to vote after 1920 meant that that whole group of voters didn't participate, even though they were highly energized and well organized. So I think there is a direct relationship. For instance, in President Obama's election in 2012, he won women voters. That is, he got a higher percentage of female voters than Romney, but he actually lost white women voters. He won women voters because African American women voters and Latina voters turned out in much higher percentages in his campaign than did other groups. So he won women voters, but he won women voters because of the centrality of women of color among women voters nationwide. Utah had actually been one of the early territories to grant women's suffrage because Mormons were under attack by the federal government because of the policy of polygamy. Now, most Mormons did not have multiple wives. They couldn't afford multiple wives. It was something that was mainly sort of something that elite Mormons were more likely to practice. But the Congress threatened to take away suffrage in the Utah territory because of polygamy. So other Western states and territories like Idaho, who passed women's suffrage, then explicitly denied it to polygamists, which they really meant Mormons, in their state or territory so that the federal government wouldn't come in. And eventually the federal government does take away voting rights from women in Utah for a period of 12 years, and then Utah, when it becomes a state, repasses a women's suffrage law and it's allowed to stand. So these Western states some of them are actually anti-Mormon. They don't want more Mormon people moving into their state, like Idaho, but it also was a way to protect them from the intrusion of the federal government. And it was directly about the fact that some Mormons practiced polygamy, which was seen as un-American.
So it wasn't illegal, it was just...
Right, exactly. Because marriage is governed by state laws, not by federal laws, and which was entirely true at that time. Now, because of Supreme Court decisions, it's a little muddier. It's likely to be lower because 2012 was the highest turnout of African American voters ever in American history. So, you know, it's hard to keep that level. It was something like 92%. I mean, it was a really unbelievably high turnout, given that less than 50% of American votes. in black communities in the South. It was astonishingly high. But I do think because Michelle and Barack Obama are out there on the trail campaigning for Clinton, and Obama has talked about it as the continuation of his policies and his presidency and his legacy, I think that will certainly keep black turnout high. Black female turnout, I think, will still outstrip any other group. They're very enthusiastic about Clinton in her own right, not just as the third term of the Obama. So I think it will be very high. I think Latino and Latina turnout this year is expected to be higher than usual. And again, I think that is largely seen as something that will benefit the Democratic Party rather than the Republicans because of the anti-immigrant claims that people fear if Trump becomes president. But Asian Americans also seem to be trending more Democratic now, and they used to trend Republican. So I think this is a very difficult election to gauge, as most experts on television will also tell you these days. Yeah, I think there's a good chance that voters of color will break all kinds of barriers this year, partly because younger voters of color haven't had to go through the kinds of challenges and obstacles that older African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans have experienced. And so I think they see voting as something that's relatively both easy to do and important. And I think older black voters, although there are some efforts to suppress black votes through voter IDs and changing polling places and a variety of other efforts in some southern and even some Midwestern states, I think the get out the vote, the kind of on the ground get out the vote campaigns, not only by the political parties, but by nonpartisan voter organizations will probably have the effect of increasing the turnout. Although I still don't know if African Americans on their own will actually hit that high mark they hit in 2012. I think a week ago I would have said it was very possible. I think after the latest announcements from the FBI, it's gotten a little muddier about what's going to happen. It's still possible that this week we'll get some other surprise announcement. And I think this election has been harder to gauge by looking at the past and thinking about patterns, because so much of it has been unique in various ways. But I do think that given the demographics of the nation, given the voting trends in recent presidential elections, I think there is a very good chance that Clinton will win, although I suspect it will be as much in spite of her being a woman as it is because she's a woman. That is, if she wins, I don't think she'll win because she's a woman candidate. I think she'll win because she's the Democratic candidate and more Democrats turn out than Republicans. But I think it's a very hard election to call at the moment.
And if she wins, do you think it's going to be a very Obama?
I think it will certainly be, I think she will certainly carry on much of Obama's legacy in important ways, like certainly the Affordable Care Act. It's going to get, if any Republican is in the White House, that act is not going to get reformed in the way it needs to be to make it work in the long term, because if you have a Republican Congress that refuses to make any revisions in the act, then it's going to continue to have these hurdles of high prices for certain kinds of policies. And I think she'll follow Obama's lead on a number of things. I suspect she'll be more interventionist in international affairs than Obama was. And I suspect she'll fight even harder for immigration reform than Obama did. But I think there will be a lot of things that are similar, but with some of her own particular concerns that will also come out.